Hi, I'm Don Wilding. I'm a local history author here on Cape Cod, and I've just written my third book of Cape Cod history. It's called Shipwrecks of Cape Cod, Stories of Tragedy and Triumph from the History Press. And this book focuses on many of the tragic maritime disasters that happened along East Thames and Cape Cod's outer beach from the period of the early 1600s right through the middle of the 20th century. The outer beach of Cape Cod saw probably between 3,000 and 4,000 shipwrecks. And that's just a rough count as to how many probably occurred out there. And there's so many of them. It's often been said that if you raised all of those shipwrecks, you could walk from Provincetown to Chatham without getting your feet wet. So it really was quite a scene out here, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that was the period of the U.S. Life-Saving Service. After the first European settlers came here, there was when you started to see an increase in shipwrecks. One of the first ones was the Sparrowhawk in Orleans off Nauset Beach in 1626. And oddly enough, one of the last ones that I focus on is the Aldea in 1984, which both happened in approximately the same area right near Pleasant Bay. So what I do in this book is I focused on 43 of these maritime disasters that occurred from Provincetown to Monomoy Island. And you can't tell this story without telling the story of the United States Life-Saving Service and then later the Coast Guard. The Life-Saving Service was formed in around 1872. And this was after the only time that anyone was involved in shipwreck rescues was the Massachusetts Humane Society. From the mid-1700s right through until the time of the Life-Saving Service, the government started the Life-Saving Service. It was actually under the umbrella of the Treasury Department. And the first superintendent was a gentleman named Sumner Kimball, who was originally from Maine, but he actually had a short teaching career here in Orleans on the Cape as a young man. And this is where he started to learn more and more about the shipwrecks that had occurred here. He grew very familiar with what it all involved. And by the time he was appointed to run the Life-Saving Service, he knew that there was a great financial need, first of all. And Kimball played the game of bureaucracy very well. In fact, when it came to getting money from Congress, there was nobody better. And with Kimball, he was able to establish life-saving stations everywhere. But on the Cape, there were 9 stations set up along Cape Cod's outer beach from Provincetown, Wood End at Provincetown, all the way down to Monomoy, where they had 2 stations. That gradually increased to 13. And there were stations at Wood End, Race Point, the dreaded Peaked Hill Bars area of Provincetown along the back shore, High Head and Truro, the Pamet Station near what is now Boston Beach, also Coast Guard Beach in Truro, which is where the Highland Station was. And then you went down to Wellfleet with the Cahoon's Hollow Station, which is now the Beachcomber. And Nauset had a station here, not the Coast Guard station that you see out there today, but there was actually a life-saving station there that predated that and is now that site is underwater. There was a station near Pleasant Bay, Poche Island area of Orleans. The old harbor station, which is actually now up in Provincetown, was originally in North Chatham. Chatham had a station as well, and then 2 on Monomoy. So the Outer Cape was very well covered during that time. And if it wasn't for these men, many more casualties. There were already a lot of people that perished, but there would have been even more casualties had it not been for the brave efforts of these men. Each station had a keeper who was kind of the captain, and they also had anywhere from 7 to 9 men at each station. During the period from August through June, every night they would send 2 men out at 4:30 to patrol the beach and keep an eye out for ships that were in distress, because usually masted ships at that time were one of the primary avenues of commerce. The ships had to pass through this area, especially between Boston and New York. There was no Cape Cod Canal. So they had to go not only between Boston and New York, but if they were coming in from overseas, they had to somehow work their way around these dreaded currents and sandbars and shoals of Cape Cod, which became a very difficult task. And this resulted in many a shipwreck. So with these men patrolling the beach, when a ship hit the outer bar, and it wasn't just getting stuck in the sand, it was like if it crashed into a wall. And the ships would start to break apart with the men still on them, with waves hitting them. And this was a very dangerous situation. They'd end up climbing up in the masts of, as we see on this cover of the book, the ship, the Castagna. They would climb into the masts, and often they would either freeze to death or be swept overboard before help could get there. So the Life-Saving Service and then the Coast Guard in 1915, they were able to save quite a few lives whenever these disasters occurred, and that was quite a bit. And then with the establishment of the Cape Cod Canal and with technology improving, it became less and less in the way of shipwrecks. So with the Life-Saving Service, the surfmen often had to use either a surf boat rescue or what they call a breeches buoy. And many of you have probably seen that up at Race Point during the summer. They do the reenactments of that. But in short, it was just a zip line from the ship to the beach. The small cannon would fire a projectile with a rope that was 500 yards long at one point. And that would reach all the way out to the ship. That would be anywhere from a couple of 100 feet to maybe several hundred yards. And fire the projectile over the mast and hope that somebody on board would be able to handle that. And that would tie it up, get this zip line, and they would step into this, what looked like a pair of pants, and they would just have this ride into shore on this zip line. If they could stay above the water and everything, that worked out even better. So they were able to save quite a few lives using these means, or they used the surf boat as well. That was just one of the many ways that they employed to save lives in these shipwrecks. And that was the Jason, which occurred in December of 1893 off of right near the Pamet River Station in Truro, which is now the area of Boston Beach. The Jason was a British ship that was coming from India, and it was carrying bales of jute to make fabric. And the Jason was spotted by several of the life-saving stations along the Outer Cape as it was approaching Cape Cod during a storm, as was mostly the case during these wrecks. And the Jason was clearly in trouble. And it was the classic case of the vessel hitting the sandbar and falling apart very quickly. And that's what was happening here. And with the case of the Jason, it struck the sandbar, and the men quickly climbed up into the masts, trying to save themselves. And this crew of 26, 25 of them were up in the masts. One man named Samuel Evans, a very young fellow, was not able to get up into the masts. He was already swept overboard by a wave. So these 25 men were hanging on for dear life, and the men from the life-saving service were trying to conduct this rescue as quickly as possible, but the conditions were not at all favorable for them to get either the surf boat or the breeches buoy line out to the ship. So in the case of these men up in the masts, they were stuck up there and actually were quite hopeful, but then everything gave and the masts toppled over and all 25 men fell into the ocean and died almost instantly. At this point, Samuel Evans somehow managed, and he wasn't wearing a lot in the way of clothes either, and this was a winter storm. So this was frigid conditions. Picture it if you can. It was horribly cold, snowing, high winds, everything. If any of you have ever walked on a beach during these conditions, you know what that feels like. Now imagine if you're in the water and trying to fight these elements. This is what Samuel Evans was up against, and he somehow clung onto one of those bales of jute. So for his good fortune, falling in the ocean he was able to do that and floated onto the beach and was recovered by the life-saving surfmen who were coming to the scene. And they managed to pull him to safety, brought him back to the station, got him warm, and the next day there was actually a picture of him taken, which is shows him wearing a life-saving sort of jacket. It was made out of cork in those days. And he's standing on the beach wearing that jacket and with the wrecked vessel off in the distance back of him. And Evans eventually went home to England. And when he got there, his father wrote a very appreciative letter to the life-saving service, thanking him for saving his son. And they said, Samuel will be heading out on another voyage very shortly. I trust a much more safer one. Well, unfortunately, Sam Evans did not make it through that last voyage, not because of a shipwreck. Unfortunately, Sam Evans fell out of his bunk and broke his neck. So it was a really tragic end, and not in the typical shipwreck sort of way. We must go. There's a distress flag in the rigging. Those were the words of Monomoy keeper Marshall Eldridge. That's according to the U.S. Life-Saving Service Annual Report of 1902. Eldridge uttered those words to his crew of the Monomoy station on the night of March 17, 1902. This was after the barges Wadena and Fitzpatrick struck on Shovelful Shoal off of Monomoy. And this was during a storm. And unfortunately, the men of these two barges, which were owned by a businessman named William Mack, were not taking the storm that they were caught up in very seriously. And then this is when, on their first night, and then by the next day, they were in a total panic over what was happening. And it's often been said, if you're with the life-saving service, they had a sort of an unofficial motto. You have to go out, but you don't have to come back. And that's what happened here. They didn't come back. The crew of Monomoy, Eldridge and most of his crew did not return. They were summoned to the scene because the Wadena flew a distress signal. The men were panicking. So that meant everybody from the Monomoy station got into a surf boat and started to head out to the Latvina to try to save it. Well, when they got there, they got everybody into the surf boat, but everybody from the crew of the barge was panicking. And before they knew it, as they're bouncing their way through this horrible high surf, the boat is losing people, surfmen and sailors alike. And before anybody knew what was happening, there was only one man left. That only left Seth Ellis. He was the only man left on board. And he was fighting his way through this horrible surf, this high surf, which had claimed everybody else on board the surf boat. At that point, he's spotted by Elmer Mayo, who's on board the Fitzpatrick. Mayo gets into a dory, fights his way through the surf, and gets to Ellis, rescues him, gets him to shore. Well, at this point, they're the only ones left. They get to shore, they're pulled into safety. They are the only survivors of this whole tragedy. There is today a memorial at the Chatham Lighthouse. If you go to the Chatham Lighthouse and you're out there by the binoculars looking out over the ocean and the inlet, there's still the monument is to the right of the lighthouse. And the monument pays tribute to everybody the lives that were claimed. And that was a lot of the surfmen who were also happened to be from Harwich and Chatham. And a lot of those men were providers for families. And the two men that were surviving the ordeal went to a lot of fundraisers. They actually were able to raise $36,000 to assist these families in need in Harwich and Chatham. So the monuments are still there, paying tribute to them, but it was also the life-saving service came to the conclusion that what happened here didn't need to happen. They could have just, if they had stayed put, they would have been fine. But like the motto says, you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. Coast Guard crews have seldom been called to such a battle as was theirs on that bitter winter morn of February 17th, 1914. Henry Beston and the Wardens of Cape Cod for the World's Work magazine, November 1923. Beston wrote this story for a magazine 5 years before The Outermost House was published. And that dealt with the wreck of the Castagna, which was a vessel heading north from South America in February of 1914. It actually left a masted ship that left Uruguay, carrying a load of guano to a port in Weymouth. Well, it never made it to Weymouth. When it left Uruguay in December of 1913, the crew was dressed for the season down there, which in Uruguay was summer. And so they're dressed in very light clothing. As they head north, they didn't bring any winter gear. So they crossed over the equator. And then as they're heading through the ocean going north, they're hit with one gale after another, one storm after another. And by the time the ship is approaching the area of New York and Massachusetts and New England, it's getting battered. The ship is in really bad shape. And it strikes the bar off of the beach in Wellfleet. This is close to the location of the old Marconi wireless station, which was also operating there at the time. And when it struck the bar, this summoned two different stations into action. The Nauset station in Eastham, and also the Cahoon's Hollow station in Wellfleet. Both crews jumped into action. Unfortunately, they had a lot of trouble getting down on the beach because this was an incredibly bad storm. There was, the temperature was about 10 degrees. It was also high winds, and the ship was in incredibly bad shape. The men on board were frozen stiff. Some of them were literally frozen stiff. And the ones that were still alive were barely hanging on for dear life. When they were finally spotted, the surfmen were not able to launch either a breeches buoy or a surf boat because the conditions were just too rough. And the breeches buoy couldn't be done because everybody on board was physically unable to handle it. So eventually they had to wait. And when the crews finally launched a surf boat and got on board, two of the people that were very instrumental in the rescue of any of the people that were still alive was Lewis Collins and his son Bernie, who was 17 years old at the time. And they were the ones who went on board and started climbing into, there were several others too, but these two, Bernie used to go with his father as a young child to a lot of these rescues. So they were the ones who were going on board, trying to retrieve people who were still alive. Many of them were dead up in the masts, trying to hold on for life, being sprayed by the ocean and freezing on contact almost. And the captain had fallen from the masts, was swept into the ocean almost after he hit the deck. He probably died from the fall, and his body was not recovered for another year and a half. And that was in Nauset Marsh, 10 miles away. So that just goes to show you the power of the ocean. Eventually, they cut down the men from the mast. Also, one man his hands were frozen to the spokes on the steering box. And Bernie had to cut the spoke with an axe to free the man. And unfortunately, the man died, and he was brought to shore. But the steering wheel is still here at the Eastham Historical Society's 1869 museum. It's on exhibit here. Shipwrecks of Cape Cod, Stories of Tragedy and Triumph is my third book. It follows, which I had a brief history of Eastham on the outer beach of Cape Cod, which was published in 2017, also by the History Press, which is the publisher for Shipwrecks of Cape Cod. And my first book was Henry Beston's Cape Cod, How the Outermost House Inspired a National Seashore. The book, The Shipwrecks of Cape Cod, focuses on 43 maritime disasters here on the Cape. And the book is available here at the Eastham Historical Society's 1869 Schoolhouse Museum, and also at bookstores across Cape Cod. And there's also links at my website, dwcapecod.com, which also updates my events. I'd like to thank the Eastham Historical Society for hosting me here, and I look forward to seeing everybody here on the Cape very soon. Thank you.